Good morning, everyone. Our first guest speaker today is Dr. David Carruthers, a professor of political science at San Diego State University. Dr. Carruthers is an expert on issues of environmental justice in Latin America. Trained in both comparative and international politics, he has conducted research on a variety of issues that fall under the umbrella term of environmental justice. These include, but are not limited to, social movements, Latin American and inter-American politics, and sustainability. In 2010, Dr. Carruthers published Indigenous Struggles, Environmental Justice, and Community Capabilities in Global Environmental Politics. He is currently working on sustainability projects in Baja California Sur and an analysis of the San Diego-Tijuana border-city relationship. Dr. Carruthers' most recent research has focused on environmental struggles of the Mapuche Indians in southern Chile and environmental justice at the US-Mexico border region. Dr. Carruthers earned an undergraduate degrees in sociology and Latin American studies at Southern Oregon University, completing a year of study at the Universidad de Guanajuato in Mexico. He continued his studies of the region, receiving a PhD from the University of Oregon in 1995, for which his dissertation focused on the alliances between indigenous and environmental organizations to pursue sustainable agriculture in rural Mexico. Today, Dr. Carruthers will share with us his insight into environmental issues that occur along our own United States-Mexico border and the region's struggles for justice. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. David Carruthers with a warm round of applause.
Well, thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning. I'd like to thank everyone for putting together such a wonderful conference. I'm sorry I missed the first day of it, but I'm still thrilled and honored to be here. So, as Jesse indicated, I want to share with you some of the work I've been doing along the US-Mexico border, trying to bring together the literatures and the research traditions of environmental justice and Latin American popular movements. My background is in political ecology and social movements, mostly in Mexico and Chile, indigenous knowledge, sustainable agriculture, forest and natural resource issues. And across the years, I am repeatedly struck by the many ways in which Latin American activists and scholars that are facing local environmental challenges weave these very conscious, compelling social justice narratives into their local struggles. So I've been working to open up the environmental discourse and justice discourse and think about the ways in which it's manifest in other parts of the world. I want to begin with just a small conceptual orientation, but mostly focus my time on a couple of environmental justice cases from the US-Mexico border. The first of these is a community struggling against industrial hazardous waste. The second is an emerging cross-border energy economy. And then I want to conclude with a few lessons more generally. I spent the last 2 days in O'Hare, so I'm not entirely sure what I missed, but I'm going on the assumption that people have some familiarity here with the U.S. environmental justice experience. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of key conceptual notions that come from the research tradition that I think are useful for the work that I'm doing here. The first of these is the concept of distributional equity. Much environmental justice research starts with this question of distribution of environmental hazards. This is where are dangerous facilities sited, who are the victims. These are questions about environmental racism, about whether or not certain communities are disproportionately exposed to toxic hazards. Secondly, I want to ask kind of the political sciencey questions about participation and about recognition. These are the procedural dimensions of injustice. How do those distributional injustices take place in the first place? Who has the power? Who makes the decisions? Who's excluded from that process? Thirdly, which you all know from the themes of this conference, environmental justice has also been a springboard for thinking about questions of global environmental equity, about global injustices north to south. An emerging discussion about climate justice, for example, or the toxics trade, which we learned about last night. That one I did catch. or sweatshops and the global economy. We live in this age of globalized system of production and distribution. Environmental justice focuses on these same kinds of questions, the distributional questions, who pays the costs, who enjoys the benefits, and also the procedural questions, who has the power, who makes these kinds of decisions, where's the justice and injustice in this global system. Now I want to turn our attention to the U.S.-Mexico border, which I find such a fascinating place. It's this unique kind of collision of the global north and the global south. The border provides a really amazing window into a lot of these really big questions about the environment and about globalization and the opportunities and the hazards of the world economy, the tensions that divide the rich countries and the poor countries. Cities like Tijuana are the industrial boom towns of the age in which we live. Tijuana is the television capital of the world. Electronics and auto parts and clothes and shoes and luggage and furniture and tools and a lot of the things that we use just every day are produced in export processing zones in cities like Tijuana, along the northern Mexico border, in Vietnam, in Honduras, in China. Tijuana is a fascinating kind of paradoxical city. It's both rich and poor. It's both first world and third world. By the aggregate indicators, it's one of the wealthier cities in Mexico. And Mexico is actually a reasonably wealthy country. It's the 14th largest economy in the world. Quite heavily industrialized. TJ has its share of billionaires who have limousine fleets and private jets and palatial mansions. It's also got a pretty substantial middle class who get fat on the same fast food that we do and live in condos and live a first world lifestyle. But it's also a testament to the failures of Mexico's development strategy. All of those factory jobs are magnets for the dispossessed and the rural poor who pour into Mexico from every corner of the country. So almost half of the population of the city works in the informal economy, not necessarily always able to find those factory jobs. Half the population lives in informal settlements that sprawl across the floors of the canyons and climb up the walls. Two-thirds of the homes in Tijuana have dirt floors. Two-thirds of the houses lack piped water. Thousands of families build their houses out of pallets that are discarded from the factories. Heartbreakingly, in many of these homes, you'll see them storing their household water in chemical barrels that they've picked up at the plant gates. Kids play in pools and in piles of dirt that are loaded with arsenic and chromium and xylene. The point here, and I think it's one that you've been exposed to throughout this event, is that there's a price to pay for all production. And in the world economy today, those who enjoy the benefits, this cascade of consumer goodies that we all take for granted, are socially disconnected and spatially disconnected from those who pay the costs. One of the women I interviewed, I think, captures this very succinctly. If the world is really neighborhoods, then poor neighborhoods like Mexico are the ones who pay much of those environmental and social costs. To illustrate this point, I want to look at a couple of different cases, and I'm going to start with the Maquiladoras sector. For many years, one of Mexico's key industrial development strategies has been to entice to the border region international factories to take advantage of low levels of taxation, low levels of regulation, close proximity to big U.S. markets, and a low-wage, largely non-unionized workforce. People in the Maquiladora region will work for a tiny fraction of U.S. or Canadian wages. The current average is about $60 for a 48-hour, 5-day work week, not much over $1 an hour. Business leaders, government leaders praise the program. They're excited about the factories. They bring jobs. They bring economic growth, development, opportunities for the cities. Over the time, over time there have been many different studies about problematic aspects of the factory, the limits of a sweatshop economy, questions of gender exploitation, worker health and safety, and so forth. My work has focused on hazardous waste and especially illegal dumping of hazardous waste. Many of the industries located in the border Maquiladoras zone produce a lot of hazardous waste. This would be not just electronics, but also auto parts, paints and solvents, chemicals, and pesticides. By the laws that establish this sector, the products are merely assembled on the Mexican side of the border where they're taking advantage of this relatively inexpensive labor force. So all of the inputs, all of the components come from the U.S. side of the border. The assembly takes place in the factories in Mexico. The goods are returned to the U.S. market. And, in theory, all of the toxic byproducts of production are supposed to be returned to the country of origin where they're to be disposed of in authorized EPA websites. Websites, where did that come from? Disposal sites. During the 1980s and 1990s, big boom years for the Maquiladora sector, compliance with that last part of it was very, very low, somewhere between 1% and 5%, meaning almost all of the industrial hazards that were created by these production facilities was going into the landscape of Tijuana. We had a good system in place for tracking this that was suspended in 2003 by the Bush administration. By 2003, when we had good data, compliance was much better. It's up to 25%, but that means 75% of industrial hazardous waste is still disappearing somewhere into those rivers and canyons and mesas. So we have manifestations, accumulation of heavy metals, chemicals in soil and water and tissue samples, neural tube birth defect clusters, respiratory problems, skin diseases, high levels of cancer. For example, car batteries. Most of us don't think about where our car batteries go when they die. To borrow from Jim last night, they go away. In Colonia Chilpancingo, they think about it. This is a community of about 12,000 people. It's located in a floodplain at the bottom of a mesa that contains one of the largest industrial parks in the city. This is a picture I took about 7 years ago of a factory called Metales y Derivados. It's an abandoned battery smelter. It's not an assembly plant, but it's a kind of recycling facility. Its products are the lead and other metals that are harvested from the batteries. All of the products and the byproducts are supposed to be returned to the United States. The factory started operating in 1972. It operated for 22 years. Almost immediately, people in Colonia Chilpancingo started to notice impacts. The river turned strange colors, the fish died off, the kids started getting sick, they started raising questions. There were fines issued, there was media coverage, there were studies, but nothing really changed until the NAFTA debate in the early 1990s when we're having trouble getting congressional votes in the United States. And the Mexican government put pressure on the Mexican Environmental Ministry to start cleaning up some of these really notorious toxic sites along the border. So in 1994, just as NAFTA comes into effect, the ministry shut down the plant. The owner of the plant simply left, abandoned the plant in Mexico, leaving behind 24,000 tons of open hazardous waste, 7,000 tons of lead slag. A community organization called the Chilpancingo Pro-Environmental Justice Collective started pushing for a cleanup. I don't have time to go into the story, but it's a story of about 12 years of direct action strategies, protests, marches, letter writing campaigns, news conferences, workshops. Also a very sophisticated legal strategy. They forged an alliance with an environmental justice group from a poor neighborhood in San Diego who brought a lawsuit to the NAFTA Environmental Commission in Montreal. This little community group, these are working class housewives, no money, no political connections, no power, no attorneys, just moms worried about sick kids, eventually won a favorable ruling from the NAFTA board in February 2002. The ruling vindicated all of their claims. Unfortunately, it came with no penalties, no resources for cleanup, so the community continued the struggle for another couple of years. Finally, in 2004, the U.S. and Mexican governments came together with a funding plan. The cleanup began in 2007. And by 2009, the site was completely remediated and the community celebrated this victory. So this is one clear success story. It's a triumph of a community that took a lot of work. It means a lot to the people in Chilpancingo. But of course, there are hundreds of battery recycling plants in Mexico. We just had a 2012 report from the CEC that found that almost 75% of U.S. car batteries are still exported into Mexico. And this is just one sector of this economy. This is not even to tap into all of the other assembly operations and all of the other export processing zones around the world. Second case is an area that's gotten almost no attention. Most of you are probably too young and too far away to remember California's disastrous experimentation with energy deregulation and privatization that happened in the late 90s and resulted in 2000 and 2001 in a series of rolling blackouts and the big fiasco with Enron and these price spikes. The energy companies determined that northern Mexico would be the site for the solution. Power plants, power lines, liquefied natural gas terminals, pipeline systems. The energy industry sees tremendous demand in the western United States, but it also knows that it's difficult to locate these kinds of industrial facilities in places like California and Oregon. They're going to confront a lot of resistance. So the assumption was we can build plants in Mexico, we can pipe that energy north, we're going to run into less political difficulty, less resistance, it's going to be cheaper to build. So we're looking at two sets of cases here today. The first is power plants. In 2002, the companies proposed over 20 power plants just for the northern Mexico border. I'm focusing initially on these two plants in Mexicali, one owned by Sempra Energy Company and the other by Intergen Services. These are wealthy companies. They're very well connected. They have a lot of political clout in Mexico. State institutions are pretty weak in Mexico. These plants were up and running by 2003 before people in Mexicali really even knew what hit them. At that point, really all that community activists could do was challenge the transmission lines that were bringing the electricity from these power plants into the United States. It was a really interesting time in which a bunch of small kind of grassroots environmental justice organizations formed an alliance across the border and started bringing a series of cases into U.S. courts. And in 2003 and in 2004, a series of judges agreed that Intergen and Sempra were sort of conspiring to export dirty electricity to California with plants located just across the border in Mexico that were not built to meet California or U.S. Emissions standards. They were literally placing plants more polluting than they could legally build in the United States just across the border in a city that has severe air pollution problems. So again, if we think of the world as neighborhoods, this is the siting of industrial hazards in a poor, brown-skinned neighborhood. That's a distributive injustice. And the people living in those communities had no say in the matter. That's a procedural injustice. Most glaringly, these plants weren't even connected to the Baja grid. Eventually, the Intergen plant started producing about 40% for Mexicali, but these are export facilities. These are mainly about carrying power on these lines up to the Imperial Valley Substation where it gets distributed northward. The Mexicans bear the pollution, Californians get the energy supply. The second, there's my grid system. The second case is liquefied natural gas. This is a very hot topic in global energy. Natural gas is the preferred fuel for power plants. It's much cheaper than oil. It's much cleaner than oil or coal. It has less than half the carbon emissions. We also have abundant supply. The world has large deposits of natural gas. Unfortunately, they're mostly located in distant places like Russia and Australia and Bolivia. It's also volatile and tricky to handle. But there's a trick. If you freeze natural gas to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, it collapses in volume by 600 times, turns into a liquid. You can load it up into a freezer tanker, haul it across vast oceans, plug it into a regasification terminal, warm it back up, it turns back into gas, you can distribute it on the pipeline system. There is no liquefied natural gas facility on the west coast of the United States. The companies know that they'll meet a lot of resistance in those locations. These are ugly, dangerous facilities. Once in a while, they've been known to explode. Again, they looked at Mexico with lots of proposals, 6 proposals right out the gate for northern Baja alone. The first 2 proposed in 2002 were to have been onshore facilities located very close to the border, one in Playas de Tijuana, which is just about 5 miles south, the other near Rosarito Beach, about 25 miles south. Mexican government almost immediately approved the permits for these projects, but as students of environmental justice know, companies underestimate the resistance of communities that are threatened by these kinds of hazards. These 2 were defeated on the streets of Tijuana. This is what environmental justice is about, the slogan, where we live, work, and play. People rally around those kinds of threats. Housewives and school kids, parents, neighborhood associations, they stop these facilities with the same kinds of strategies, protests and blockades and letter writing campaigns and petitions. Got almost no press in the United States, got a lot of press in Mexico, to the point that all of the municipal officials involved in permitting started determining that this was too much bad publicity. They withdrew their support for the project. Ultimately, both of these companies said, forget it, we're withdrawing the proposals. Score 1 for the smart folks at Sempra, who said, the problem is if you locate dirty and dangerous industrial facilities in residential neighborhoods, you run into trouble. Let's move away from the people. Let's buy up 400 acres of spectacular undeveloped coastal land, a big chunk of property about 15 miles north of Ensenada, probably about 70 miles south. Move away from the people. So the Costa Azul project moved forward. This is a massive facility. It's got 2 200-foot insulated towers. It's got a jetty and a pier that can handle ships from around the world. It came online about 5 years ago. This is kind of the same story. The ships come in, they park, they regasify. The gas is almost entirely shipped on the pipeline system north into California. It does happen to make one little stop over there in Mexicali to fuel those new shiny electricity plants. There are several other liquefied natural gas proposals. The economics has changed somewhat. Some of these are clearly dead, others are dormant. The summary is, I think I'll spare those and move right on. The environmental justice framework has been really important. This message of injustice is something that resonates with great power in Mexico. It's created a very sophisticated framework for cross-border organizing. At this point, just in California, Baja California border region, we have about 35 community environmental justice groups that remain active, very well connected across the border. And that sense of injustice is something that's, I think, captured very effectively by a senatorial debate over the liquefied natural gas proposals in which one senator said, look, to authorize these plants is to betray the country. It's a form of treason. I also really like this protest banner, which appeared in a local paper that really, again, is emblematic of that sense of disrespect for those of you who read Spanish. Mexico, there are those who love you and those who use you. And use in Spanish spells out USA. So, whoops. That was premature. Book plug. Okay. So that's why I find the environmental justice movement such a fascinating movement, something that really connects with people and is, I believe, having a transformative, kind of empowering impact throughout Latin America. A few years ago, I put together a book working with scholars from around the region. We produced about a dozen studies, one of biofuels in Brazil, water privatization in Bolivia, mining in Argentina, military base in Puerto Rico. And what we found in these studies is that environmental justice is in fact a movement that's been around and present and very tangible in Latin American politics for years. It doesn't emerge in the forms that we're familiar with in the United States. It doesn't come from a kind of civil rights tradition. These aren't scholars who use geographic information systems typically to map distributional hazards in urban environments. But in multiple kind of distinctive local forms, Latin American activists and analysts are fusing concerns for environmental health and facing local environmental challenges by weaving in these very strong narratives about social justice, what Joan Martinez refers to as the environmentalism of the poor. Those of you who are familiar with Latin America know that this is a region that has a very rich tradition of organizing over social justice issues. The region is replete with vibrant popular movements that have for decades struggled against dictatorships and repression and economic injustices. And environmental justice weaves directly into that infrastructure, that social infrastructure, and that organizing experience. I will conclude by saying this is not a uniformly inspirational story. There are serious limits, many setbacks, some heartbreaking stories. But I do believe it's fair to conclude that environmental justice has a lot of promise in Latin America and in other parts of the world, both as a banner for popular resistance, for activists and community leaders who are confronting challenging environmental inequities, and also, I think, as a conceptual framework for scholars and policymakers who are trying to develop a blueprint for a more socially just and a more sustainable future for Latin America. So I'll stop there and Q&A.
I have a sort of pragmatic question.
Okay.
The situation now is that liquid natural gas is coming into the desert. It's going to the plants that used to burn coal, the plants, which is partly powering, I assume, residential and industrial needs in Vermont more cleanly than either the coal would have before or whatever domestic resources they would have been using. So if we look at this from a substantive perspective, it seems to me that northwestern Mexico is probably cleaner as a result now of this series of events. It would have been in the absence of the export of either the plants originally or the LNG terminal later.
The facilities don't actually produce for Mexico for the most part. The thing that I'm pointing out here is pragmatically what the energy companies are doing is determining that they can regasify and place power plants on the Mexican side of the border to produce electricity that gets piped mainly into the United States.
I understand that.
So they're not facilities that were there and helping Mexico prior to their development. The facilities aren't there to clean up the Mexican air. They're there to meet energy demand in the United States by sort of evading the costs and restrictions and hassles of locating them in the United States.
I understand that.
So coal wasn't the alternative for Mexico.
My question is, has the substantive effect, though, been to northern Mexico?
Yeah.
If that wasn't the intent, which I fully agree, obviously it's not.
Yeah, that's a hard one to ask. Baja was always kind of separated from the main Mexican grid system. Mexico's system isn't really coal-fired, it's mainly oil-fired because Mexico's an oil-producing country. So there wasn't a tradition of coal-based power plants in Mexico. They're more oil-based. And there are a lot of different debates about the best way to go about it. One of the problems, I think I have to say I don't, in exact quantitative terms, and if I were to try to measure it in sort of greenhouse gas emissions, I don't actually know the answer to the question whether or not the volume of greenhouse gas emissions being emitted from northern Mexico are higher or lower than they would have been with or without the plants. Because the plants didn't exist before this project commenced, I'm going to assume that they're up. I agree that it's better that they're up using natural gas than something like coal or oil. But they haven't really displaced the power plants that the Baja grid uses, which continue to be very dirty and oil-based. So in Rosarito, for instance, there is a big old power plant that's kind of an old-fashioned one that kicks out a pretty nasty plume of smoke, and it's still oil-fueled. The two in Mexicali are natural gas plants that didn't used to exist. They don't really much help Mexicali. For several years, they were entirely export facilities. There's now some electricity going into the Baja grid. So that's about as satisfying as I can answer the question.
Back to the U.S. And you said it was going up a little bit, and then President Bush cut the program.
Canceled the Hazardous program.
Right. So what I'm wondering is what's happened under the Obama administration, whether we're getting data again, whether trends are improving, or what's happening?
I don't, when the Hazardous program was suspended, it's like people stopped asking the question, astonishingly enough. I think there is an assumption, and it's not so much about the Obama versus the Bush administration suspended funding for the Hazardous program, said, look, this program's expensive, we don't know if it's providing useful data, it's not really our problem, so we stopped collecting systematically data about compliance. The real question would be in terms of Mexican politics, whether there's anybody in Mexico who's committed to maintaining this database. Mexico has actually made significant progress in the development of a really rudimentary framework for right-to-know laws. But I don't know of any kind of systematic database that's tracking the compliance with the cross-border component of it. So I really think we just don't know much about the data. I do believe that if you talk to people, talking to people who are involved in the industry today, the kind of anecdotal response is, oh, things are much better, most companies are being more compliant than they used to be. But then if you talk to people in the communities around the factories, they say, oh, it's as bad as it's ever been, and it's all just kind of anecdotal at this point. It's frustrating to researchers, certainly. Yes, sir.
One of the things I appreciated about your talk, which I thought was great, was the comparative observations that you made from other parts of Latin America. And I was wondering if you could provide some additional insight and framework perhaps for us to think about the possibilities for success or failure of different social movements that develop around trying to address these or challenge these environmental injustices by looking at sort of the political space which is available in Mexico, and compare that, contrast that with what we have in Honduras, pre and post to what we have in Bolivia, before and during the Morales administration, which does not have a completely stellar record on some of these kinds of issues.
Yeah, so Latin America is, it's actually fiction to call it a thing. Because Latin America is such a huge region and it's so diverse and it has so many different kinds of landscapes and political configurations and characteristics and cultural and political traditions. So it's very hard to speak in kind of general terms. And I did say sort of multiple and distinctive and locally adapted forms because you can't really speak in very general terms. It's interesting, when I first started this work, and it was kind of incidental, I just spend a lot of time in Tijuana because I love crossing the border, and I started hearing people talking about this stuff. And I was down in southern Chile, and I heard people talking about, well, this just isn't fair, well, this is an injustice, why is it that they're picking on us, is it just because we're poor, is it just because we have brown skin? And it's like, this is kind of like environmental justice stuff. And so I'm noticing it in different ways in different parts of Latin America. And my initial question is it very sophisticated in the border region just because it somehow is diffusing across the border, because there are these cross-border alliances and people cross the border a lot and they pick up these kinds of trends? And what I concluded over time is that arguably the shape that it takes in northern Mexico is more influenced by the kind of gringo version of environmental justice than you might see in other parts of Latin America. So for example, in much of South America, you'll hear the language conflictos ambientales, so they'll just call them environmental conflicts. But then when you interrogate them about what does conflicto ambiental mean, then they say, well, it's about social injustice. It's about marginalized communities being picked on by mining companies. It's about the impacts of decisions that are made by people who are powerful, and those of us who are getting hit by those impacts not having any political power, and about us educating ourselves and mobilizing and figuring out how to organize to confront those challenges. And I thought, well, okay, so that's clearly environmental justice kind of writ large. The contours of that vary dramatically by local, depending on what cases you're looking at. And there's some really sad ones in Mexico, even reasonably close to the border, where very unsuccessful. So around the world, I would say one of the interesting and frustrating things, students of Latin American politics, especially left-leaning students of Latin American politics, are kind of excited because this is a region that's in general kind of pushing back against the Washington Consensus neoliberal project, and you've got the so-called pink tide of progressive, pragmatic center-left Latin American leaders who are trying to balance social justice concerns with economic development. And on this issue, the record is not so great. You look at Correa, he's antagonized indigenous communities with policies and decisions that they see as overtly hostile to their survival and as egregious manifestations of environmental justice. And I don't want to step into Daniel's terrain about Peru, but there are a lot of troubling trends. Colombia is another area where you see a lot of really difficult cases where people certainly are using language about social injustice and local environmental struggles. Like the palm oil plantations of Colombia is another one that I've done some reading on. But the contours of local politics is what really determines how effective they are at using those resources to get some kind of compliance or cooperation from local officials or from federal officials. And then the kind of peculiar thing about the NAFTA case is that we do have this trinational commission, this Commission for Environmental Cooperation. So there's an opportunity for Mexicans to say, look, our government is useless and flagrantly willing to violate its own environmental laws, but there's this power above the state. It doesn't have enforcement, it doesn't have money, but it can kind of lever in some pressure from above the state. Not all countries in Latin America have that kind of capacity. Yes?
You mentioned when explaining how Tijuana was, that there was the rich section of Tijuana and also the poor section of Tijuana. And I was wondering if there was any response to what was happening in the poorer sections among the richer ones that are living basically in the same region, I assume.
Yeah.
Is there like a housing industry movement that might be organized in the middle or upper middle classes, or is it just primarily lower sort of poor class struggle at this point?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it comes from kind of the way we think about the way environmental hazards are distributed in U.S. cities. And so when I first went to Tijuana and started driving around and talking to people and trying to map this out, I started with the idea that, well, clearly the rich, wealthy areas aren't going to be exposed to environmental hazards, and the poorer, more marginalized ones are. And it's actually a lot more muddled than that. For one thing, it's pretty jumbled together. The city has a very complex topography. It's all broken up by mesas and canyons. The joke is, you know, if you crumple up a piece of paper and throw it on the table, that's what Tijuana looks like. So it's a very discontiguous city. And wealth and poverty are often kind of intermingled. And the industrial factories, the industrial zones are scattered all over the cities. But in general, it does seem to be that the environmental hazards tend to be much closer to poor people, mainly because the poorest people move in to informal settlements nearest to the factories because they want to be able to walk to work. So it's a whole set of different dynamics. The other thing that was striking to me is the relative generalized lack of awareness. People in other parts of Tijuana have no idea that this story was even taking place, including other communities that are facing environmental hazards. Well, do you know about the metales y derivados struggle? You know, I don't know what you're talking about. And wealthy people, or upper middle class people, really are kind of oblivious to what's going on in all of those colonias, those informal settlements, because they just never go into them. They live their lives in kind of separate little bubbles. And, you know, the people crisscross all over the city, but there's just enough, it's a discontiguous city and people tend to live within their own domains, and so there's not a lot of recognition, I think. Yes?
Could you draw parallels between your work in northern Mexico and the work that you do in Chile with the Mapuches? In terms of this distributive injustice, for example, racialized poor being the target in Mexico, much more amorphous group, much more organized, and the Mapuche being the indigenous group of Chile, and the south, very far from major cities.
Yeah.
In the world, pretty much forgotten.
Yeah, that's another thing that doesn't come out at all in this talk. So in Mexico, it's really not a racial thing the way I study it. It's more about social class and about this kind of big north-south distributional question. In Chile, it's very clearly targeted towards that ethno-linguistic distinctiveness is an element of it. And so again, back to that point that I made earlier, not that this is a cop-out, the local forms in which it takes vary a lot. And in Chile, the main interest I've had is the way in which social justice is part of the indigenous worldview of the Mapuche, and how they have a kind of distinctive cosmology about their relationship to nature and the kind of sacredness that they see in their land, and the lack of appreciation and inattentiveness to those dimensions among they call them the colonizers or the Chileans, sort of the white people from north. The Mapuche live in a very isolated region, and historically the Spanish colonial influence was pretty limited, so they're quite physically separated from the rest of Chile, and they think of themselves as living in their own sort of Mapuche homeland. And the struggles are about how forestry companies and hydroelectric companies come into that land and extract electricity, again, and timber products, and also fisheries, and make themselves rich, despoil our landscape, demean our people, rob us of opportunities, divisions among the community about, do we cooperate with that because there are opportunities, or do we resist it? So the contours are quite different, but what I've really focused in on is the way in which the kind of the indigenous cosmology of the Mapuche creates a distinctive sense of their connection to land, the identity politics, the sense of representation, political voice, the ways in which they've tried to engage the state, the way in which the state has sort of undervalued indigenous voice. Time's up? Okay.